In 1978, China was one of the poorest countries on earth. 88% of the population lived in extreme poverty, surviving on less than $2 per day. The average Chinese person earned less than $200 per year. That's poorer than most African countries at the time. Most people were farmers living in rural villages with no electricity, no running water, and barely enough food to survive. Famines had killed tens of millions just years earlier. China was economically irrelevant on the global stage. Then something extraordinary happened. Over the next 40 years, China lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. 800 million. That's more than the entire population of Europe, more than the United States and Mexico combined. In 4 decades, China went from one of the poorest nations to the second largest economy in the world. Cities that were fishing villages in 1980 became megacities with populations of 15 million. Shenzhen had 30,000 people in 1979. Today it has over 12 million and looks like a science fiction movie. China built the world's largest high-speed rail network connecting the entire country. They constructed more infrastructure in 20 years than most countries built in a century. Chinese GDP grew at an average of 9 to 10% per year for 40 consecutive years. No country in history has sustained that level of growth for that long. Today, China is the world's largest manufacturer, largest exporter, and largest trading partner for over 120 countries. They produce everything from smartphones to solar panels to steel. But this transformation didn't come from democracy or free markets. It came from an authoritarian government making calculated strategic decisions that mixed capitalism with central planning in ways no one had tried before. And it came with enormous costs: environmental destruction, massive inequality, human rights violations, a surveillance state, suppression of dissent. The greatest economic success story in history is also one of the most morally complicated. So how did China do it? How did they lift 800 million people out of poverty faster than anyone thought possible? What was the strategy? What were the costs? And can any other country replicate what China achieved? In this video, I'm breaking down exactly how China pulled off the greatest economic transformation in human history, what they sacrificed to do it, and what it means for the world. Let's get into it. To understand how incredible China's transformation was, you need to see how catastrophically poor and broken China was before 1978. Because China wasn't just poor. They had suffered through decades of economic disasters that killed tens of millions of people. In 1949, the Communist Party under Mao Zedong won the Chinese Civil War and established the People's Republic of China. Mao promised to transform China into a modern industrial power and eliminate poverty. Instead, his policies created some of the worst famines and economic catastrophes in human history. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, a campaign to rapidly industrialize China through collectivization and central planning. Private farms were abolished. Millions of farmers were forced into collective farms called communes. Mao ordered farmers to abandon farming and produce steel instead, believing China needed industrial output more than food. The result was predictable and horrific. Agricultural production collapsed. People melted down farming tools to meet steel production quotas, making it impossible to farm. The steel they produced was worthless, low-quality scrap that couldn't be used for anything. Meanwhile, crops rotted in fields because there weren't enough people to harvest them. Between 1959 and 1961, somewhere between 15 and 45 million people starved to death. This was entirely man-made. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was the result of catastrophic economic policies that destroyed food production. Then, in 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. This was a political campaign to purge anyone deemed insufficiently loyal to Mao and communist ideology. Schools and universities were shut down. Intellectuals, teachers, doctors, and engineers were persecuted, tortured, or killed. Red Guards, mostly young students, destroyed anything considered traditional or Western. Books were burned. Cultural artifacts were smashed. An entire generation lost years of education. Economic development essentially stopped for a decade. By the time Mao died in 1976, China was economically devastated. The average Chinese person earned about $180 per year. 88% of the population lived in extreme poverty. Most people were subsistence farmers barely producing enough food to survive. China had almost no industry, no infrastructure, no foreign investment, no trade with the outside world. The country was isolated, impoverished, and falling further behind the rest of the world every year. When Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, he inherited a country that was economically broken and desperately needed change. And Deng understood something that Mao never did. Ideology doesn't feed people. Economic growth does. Deng was willing to abandon communist economic principles if it meant making China prosperous, and that pragmatism would change everything. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping became China's paramount leader and made a decision that would change the course of human history. He would abandon Mao's rigid communist economics and open China to capitalism, markets, and the outside world. Deng wasn't a Democrat. He was a lifelong Communist Party member who believed in authoritarian control. But he was also a pragmatist who cared more about results than ideology. His famous quote captured everything. "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." Meaning it doesn't matter if an economic system is capitalist or communist, as long as it works and makes people less poor. Deng looked at China's situation in 1978 and saw a disaster. Hundreds of millions living in poverty, an economy that had barely grown in decades, a country falling further behind while neighbors like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan were rapidly developing. He understood that continuing Mao's policies would keep China poor forever. So Deng launched what he called reform and opening up. This was a fundamental restructuring of China's economic system. The goal was simple: make China rich by any means necessary, even if it meant adopting capitalist practices that went against communist ideology. Deng started with agriculture because that's where most Chinese people lived and worked. He allowed farmers to sell their produce at market prices instead of being forced to give everything to the state at fixed prices. This created immediate incentives. If a farmer worked harder and grew more crops, they could sell the surplus and keep the profit. Agricultural productivity exploded. Within just a few years, food production increased dramatically and rural incomes started rising. But Deng knew agriculture alone wouldn't make China a modern economy. China needed industry, factories, technology, and integration into the global economy. The problem was that China had no experience with capitalism, no foreign investment, and no knowledge of how market economies worked. Deng's solution was brilliant and unprecedented. Instead of trying to transform the entire country at once, which would be chaotic and risky, he would create experimental zones where capitalism could be tested in controlled areas. If it worked, expand it. If it failed, contain the damage. This became the Special Economic Zones strategy, and it started in a small fishing village in southern China that nobody had heard of. That village was called Shenzhen, and what happened there over the next 40 years would become the model for China's entire economic transformation. Deng was essentially saying, we'll try capitalism in a few cities, see if it works, and if it does, we'll spread it across the whole country. This experimental approach allowed China to modernize without the political risk of abandoning communism entirely. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping designated Shenzhen and 3 other coastal cities as special economic zones. These zones would operate under completely different rules than the rest of China. Foreign companies could invest there, private businesses were allowed, market prices replaced central planning, and crucially, these zones could trade freely with the outside world without Communist Party interference. Shenzhen was chosen because it was right across the border from Hong Kong, which was still a British colony and one of the richest cities in Asia. Deng wanted Shenzhen to learn from Hong Kong's capitalist success and attract Hong Kong investors into China. In 1979, Shenzhen was a fishing village of about 30,000 people. There were no factories, no skyscrapers, just small farms and fishermen. Within 5 years, Shenzhen was transformed. Foreign companies, mostly from Hong Kong and Taiwan initially, poured billions into building factories. They came because labor was incredibly cheap, land was cheap, and the Chinese government offered massive tax breaks and favorable policies to attract investment. Manufacturing exploded. Factories making toys, textiles, electronics, and consumer goods employed hundreds of thousands of workers. People from rural areas across China migrated to Shenzhen looking for factory jobs that paid far better than farming. The city's population grew from 30,000 to over 300,000 by the mid-1980s. Today, Shenzhen has over 12.5 million people. It went from fishing village to megacity in 40 years. And it's not just any city. Shenzhen is now China's tech capital. Companies like Huawei, Tencent, and DJI are headquartered there. It's one of the richest and most advanced cities in China. The special economic zone model worked so well that China replicated it. Shanghai, Guangzhou, and dozens of other coastal cities became economic zones with special rules favoring capitalism and foreign investment. This created a two-speed China. Coastal cities with special economic zones grew rapidly, became wealthy, and integrated into global trade. Meanwhile, inland rural areas remained poor and underdeveloped for decades. But the coastal strategy was deliberate. Deng understood that transforming all of China simultaneously was impossible. So he focused development on areas that could succeed quickly and generate wealth that would eventually spread inland. The special economic zones did something else critically important. They created a new class of Chinese entrepreneurs and business owners who became wealthy through capitalism. These people had incentives to support continued economic reform because they were profiting from it. And their success proved to skeptical Communist Party members that market economics could work in China without destroying political control. By the 1990s, the special economic zone model had proven so successful that China started applying market reforms across the entire country. But coastal cities and foreign investment were only part of the story. China also needed to industrialize the rural areas where most people still lived. While special economic zones transformed coastal cities, hundreds of millions of Chinese people still lived in rural areas as poor farmers. Deng Xiaoping needed a strategy to industrialize the countryside and lift rural poverty. The solution was Township and Village Enterprises, or TVEs. These were small factories and businesses owned collectively by rural communities, not by the central government or private individuals. The idea was simple. Villages and townships could start their own businesses, hire local farmers as workers, and keep the profits in the community. This created jobs in rural areas so people didn't have to migrate to cities to escape poverty. In the early 1980s, the Chinese government gave rural communities permission to start TVEs. Local governments could set up factories making textiles, construction materials, food processing, simple manufacturing, anything that could generate income. And these enterprises took off explosively. By the mid-1990s, there were over 25 million township and village enterprises across China, employing over 130 million people. That's more workers than the entire manufacturing sector of the United States. These weren't large, sophisticated factories. Most were small operations, making basic products like bricks, cement, furniture, clothing, or processed food. But they provided income to rural families who previously had nothing except subsistence farming. A farmer could work in the fields during planting and harvest season, then work in the local factory during off-seasons. This supplemental income dramatically improved rural living standards. Township and village enterprises also had another critical benefit. They allowed rural people to industrialize without massive migration to cities. If everyone in the countryside had moved to urban areas looking for work, Chinese cities would have been overwhelmed with homeless, unemployed people. TVEs created jobs locally, reducing migration pressure. But by the late 1990s, many township and village enterprises started facing problems. They were inefficient compared to private companies. Management was often poor because they were run by local officials with no business experience. And as China opened up more to private enterprise and foreign competition, many TVEs couldn't compete. Millions of TVEs shut down or were privatized in the 2000s. Workers lost jobs and rural unemployment increased. But by then, TVEs had already served their purpose. They had provided a bridge for rural China from subsistence farming to industrial employment. They had kept hundreds of millions of people employed and lifted incomes during the critical 1980s and 90s when China was still developing. And they demonstrated that industrialization could happen even in remote rural areas if communities had the freedom and resources to start businesses. The combination of special economic zones in coastal cities and township and village enterprises in rural areas created jobs and income growth across China. But the biggest transformation was still to come. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, and that decision turned China into the factory of the world. In December 2001, China officially joined the World Trade Organization after 15 years of negotiations. This was the single most important moment in China's economic transformation. WTO membership gave China access to global markets with reduced tariffs and trade barriers. Foreign companies could now invest in China more easily, and Chinese exports could flood into the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world with fewer restrictions. The impact was immediate and staggering. China became the world's factory almost overnight. Why did companies move manufacturing to China? 3 reasons. First, labor was incredibly cheap. Chinese factory workers earned a fraction of what American or European workers made. A worker in the United States might earn $15 to $20 per hour. A Chinese worker earned $1 to $2 per hour for the same work. Second, China had massive surplus labor. Hundreds of millions of rural Chinese were willing to move to cities and work in factories for wages that seemed low by Western standards, but were life-changing compared to farming. Third, the Chinese government made it easy. They built industrial parks with infrastructure already in place. They offered tax breaks to foreign companies. They kept environmental and labor regulations minimal so companies could operate cheaply. Western companies saw an opportunity to cut costs dramatically by moving production to China. Apple, Nike, Dell, almost every major consumer brand started manufacturing in China. Entire industries relocated. The results were astounding. In 2000, China's total exports were about $250 billion. By 2010, just 10 years after joining the WTO, exports had grown to over $1.5 trillion, a 6-fold increase in a decade. China became the largest exporter in the world, surpassing Germany and the United States. Chinese factories produced everything: clothes, shoes, toys, electronics, furniture, machinery, steel, chemicals, literally everything. If you bought a product in the 2000s, there was a very high chance it was made in China. This export boom created tens of millions of factory jobs. Young people migrated from rural villages to coastal factory cities like Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Dongguan. They worked long hours in difficult conditions, but the wages were significantly higher than farming. Families could send money back to rural relatives, lifting entire communities out of poverty. WTO entry also brought foreign investment flooding into China. Companies built factories, trained Chinese workers, and transferred technology and knowledge. Chinese engineers learned advanced manufacturing techniques. Chinese companies learned how to compete internationally. And the Chinese government made sure that foreign companies had to partner with Chinese firms and share technology as a condition of market access. This allowed China to absorb knowledge and eventually build their own competitive industries. By 2010, China had become the world's second largest economy, surpassing Japan. The country that had been economically irrelevant just 30 years earlier was now indispensable to global supply chains. But exports and factories alone don't explain how 800 million people escaped poverty. China also needed massive infrastructure to connect the country and enable economic growth everywhere. Between 1990 and 2020, China built more infrastructure than any country in history. And this infrastructure was absolutely critical to lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty, because you can't have economic growth without roads, railways, electricity, and ports connecting people to markets. Let's start with high-speed rail. In 2008, China had 0 kilometers of high-speed rail. Today, China has over 42,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, more than the rest of the world combined. These trains travel at 300 kilometers per hour and connect every major city in China. You can travel from Beijing to Shanghai over 1,000 kilometers in under 5 hours. This connectivity transformed the economy. Businesses could ship products faster. Workers could commute longer distances. Cities that were isolated became connected to economic centers. Then there's the highway system. China built over 170,000 kilometers of expressways, the longest highway network in the world. Before the 1990s, many rural areas had dirt roads that became impassable during rain. Now, even remote villages are connected to modern highways. This allowed farmers to transport goods to cities and access markets that were previously unreachable. China also undertook the largest urbanization in human history. In 1980, only 20% of Chinese people lived in cities. Today, over 65% live in urban areas. That's over 500 million people who moved from rural farms to cities in just 40 years. To accommodate this, China built entire cities from scratch. Dozens of cities with populations over 1 million were constructed in decades. High-rise apartments, subway systems, airports, shopping centers, all built at a pace the world had never seen. Critics called many of these ghost cities because they were built before people moved there. But over time, most filled up as rural migrants sought urban jobs and housing. China also invested heavily in energy infrastructure. They built massive coal power plants, dams, nuclear reactors, and more recently, solar and wind farms. The Three Gorges Dam, the world's largest hydroelectric project, generates enough electricity to power tens of millions of homes. Reliable electricity meant factories could operate, businesses could function, and rural areas could develop. And ports. China built or expanded dozens of major ports to handle the massive export boom. Shanghai's port is now the busiest container port in the world, handling over 40 million shipping containers per year. How did China pay for all this infrastructure? Government spending financed by debt and economic growth? China's government borrowed heavily, but because the economy was growing at 9 to 10% annually, the debt remained manageable. Local governments also sold land to developers and used revenue to fund infrastructure projects. The infrastructure revolution created millions of construction jobs, connected remote areas to markets, and enabled businesses to operate efficiently across the entire country. Without this infrastructure, China's economic growth would have been impossible. But this rapid growth and industrialization came with enormous costs that are often ignored when people celebrate China's success. China's economic miracle lifted 800 million people out of poverty, but it came with costs that are staggering and still being paid today. Let's be honest about what China sacrificed to achieve this growth. First, environmental destruction on a scale never seen before. China industrialized faster than any country in history, and they did it with almost no environmental regulations. Factories dumped toxic waste into rivers. Coal plants spewed pollution into the air. Cities became so polluted that breathing the air was equivalent to smoking cigarettes. Beijing's air quality regularly reached hazardous levels where people couldn't go outside safely. Children developed respiratory diseases. Cancer rates in industrial areas skyrocketed. By the 2000s, 16 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world were in China. Rivers turned black from industrial chemicals. Farmland became contaminated with heavy metals. The environmental damage will take generations and trillions of dollars to clean up. Second, massive inequality. While hundreds of millions escaped poverty, the wealth wasn't distributed evenly. Coastal cities became rich, while inland rural areas stayed poor. The gap between urban and rural incomes grew enormous. A factory worker in Shanghai could earn 10 times more than a farmer in rural Guizhou province. Inequality within cities also exploded. A small elite became incredibly wealthy through business ownership and connections to the Communist Party. Corruption was rampant. Party officials took bribes, embezzled funds, and used their positions to enrich themselves and their families. Meanwhile, migrant workers lived in terrible conditions, working 12 to 14-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week, for wages barely above subsistence. Third, human rights violations and authoritarianism. China's government maintained absolute political control throughout the economic transformation. Any dissent was crushed. The Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, where students demanded democracy and freedom, ended with the military killing hundreds or possibly thousands of protesters. Freedom of speech doesn't exist. Independent media is banned. The internet is censored. Anyone criticizing the government risks imprisonment. In Xinjiang, the government has detained over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in re-education camps, citing security concerns but engaging in cultural suppression and forced labor. Fourth, labor exploitation. The factories that lifted millions out of poverty often had horrific working conditions. Workers lived in cramped dormitories. Safety standards were minimal. Industrial accidents killed thousands. Foxconn, the company that makes iPhones, had to install suicide nets around their factories because workers were jumping to their deaths due to brutal conditions and stress. Fifth, the hukou system created a permanent underclass. This is a household registration system that ties people to their birthplace. If you're born in a rural area, you're classified as rural even if you move to a city. Rural migrants working in cities can't access urban schools, healthcare, or social services. Their children are denied education in the cities where they work. This created a two-tier society where hundreds of millions of people are treated as second-class citizens in their own country. China achieved the greatest poverty reduction in history, but they did it through authoritarianism, environmental destruction, labor exploitation, and human rights violations. The question is whether the ends justified the means. So let's talk about the actual number. 800 million people lifted out of extreme poverty. What does that actually mean, and how did it happen? Extreme poverty is defined as living on less than $2.15 per day adjusted for purchasing power. In 1981, about 88% of China's population, roughly 770 million people, lived below this line. By 2020, that number had dropped to less than 1%. Over 800 million people crossed above the poverty line. To put this in perspective, that's more than the entire population of Europe. It's more than double the population of the United States. It's the equivalent of lifting every person in North America and South America combined out of poverty in just 40 years. No country has ever achieved poverty reduction at this scale and speed. How did it actually happen on the ground? It started with agriculture reform in the 1980s. When farmers were allowed to sell surplus crops at market prices instead of giving everything to the state, rural incomes immediately increased. Families that were barely surviving suddenly had enough to eat and some extra income. Then, township and village enterprises provided non-farm jobs in rural areas. A farmer could work in a local factory and earn wages in addition to farming. This supplemental income was often enough to lift families above the poverty line. Next came the migration to cities. Hundreds of millions of rural Chinese moved to urban areas for factory jobs. A migrant worker making $2 to $3 per hour in a Shenzhen factory was earning far more than they ever could farming. Even though conditions were harsh, the income transformed their lives. They could send money back to families in rural villages, lifting entire communities. Infrastructure development connected remote areas to markets. A village that used to be isolated with dirt roads suddenly had a highway access. Farmers could transport goods to cities and sell at higher prices. Electricity reached rural areas, enabling small businesses and improving quality of life. Education expansion meant children from poor families could attend school and eventually get higher-paying jobs. China invested heavily in primary and secondary education. Literacy rates increased dramatically. A generation of educated workers could move into manufacturing, services, and eventually higher-skilled jobs. And finally, sheer economic growth created opportunities. When an economy grows at 9 to 10% annually for 40 years, wealth spreads even to the bottom. Jobs become available, wages rise, living standards improve. But here's what's important to understand. Most of the 800 million people who escaped poverty didn't become middle class. They moved from extreme poverty, struggling to afford food, to low income, able to afford basic necessities, and some modest improvements. A rural family that could barely eat in 1980 might have a small apartment, a refrigerator, and enough income for their children to attend school by 2010. That's life-changing, but they're not wealthy. China's poverty reduction was about moving massive numbers of people from desperate poverty to basic economic security. It was about going from starvation risk to stability. And that achievement, despite all the costs and problems, remains the most successful anti-poverty campaign in human history. China lifted 800 million people out of poverty and became the second largest economy in the world. But today, China faces serious challenges that threaten future growth and raise questions about whether they can continue their economic success. First, the middle income trap. This is when a country grows rapidly from poor to middle income, but then gets stuck and can't advance to high income developed status. China's GDP per capita is around $13,000, significantly higher than 40 years ago, but still far below developed countries like the United States at 70,000 or South Korea at 35,000. Moving from middle income to high income requires transitioning from low-cost manufacturing to high-value innovation, technology, and services. Many countries get stuck because they lose the low-wage advantage that made them competitive, but haven't developed the innovation capacity to compete with advanced economies. China is trying to avoid this trap by investing heavily in technology, research, and moving up the value chain. But it's not guaranteed to work. Second, massive debt. China's total debt, including government, corporate, and household debt, is over 300% of GDP. Local governments borrowed enormous amounts to fund infrastructure projects, and many of those debts are unpayable. Real estate developers borrowed billions to build apartments, and many are now bankrupt. The property sector, which represents about 30% of China's economy, is in crisis. Major developers like Evergrande have defaulted on hundreds of billions in debt. If the property sector collapses completely, it could trigger a financial crisis. Third, demographic collapse. China's population is aging rapidly and shrinking. The one-child policy, enforced from 1979 to 2015, created a demographic disaster. Fewer young workers are entering the workforce while the elderly population is exploding. By 2050, over one-third of Chinese people will be over 65. Who will support them? Who will work in the factories? China's working-age population has already started declining. This will drag down economic growth. Fourth, U.S.-China tensions and decoupling. The United States sees China as a strategic rival and is actively trying to reduce dependence on Chinese manufacturing. The U.S. has imposed tariffs, restricted technology exports, and encouraged companies to move production out of China to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico. If global companies shift supply chains away from China, it will cost millions of Chinese jobs and slow growth. Fifth, the authoritarian governance model is becoming a liability. Under Xi Jinping, China has become more authoritarian, more controlling, and less open to markets. The government has cracked down on tech companies like Alibaba and Tencent. They've imposed strict regulations that scared away investors. Foreign companies are increasingly nervous about operating in China because the government can arbitrarily change rules, seize assets, or punish companies for political reasons. And sixth, innovation challenges. China is good at copying and manufacturing, but developing cutting-edge original technology is harder. The US and allies are blocking China's access to advanced semiconductors and manufacturing equipment. Without access to the most advanced chips, China's AI development, military technology, and high-tech industries will be limited. China has tried to develop domestic alternatives, but is still years behind. These challenges don't mean China will collapse, but they do mean the easy growth is over. The next phase requires innovation, productivity improvements, and navigating a hostile international environment. So what can we learn from China's economic transformation? And can any other country replicate what China achieved? Let's start with what China did right. First, they focused on economic growth above ideology. Deng Xiaoping was willing to abandon communist economics if it meant making people richer. This pragmatism allowed China to adopt capitalist markets while maintaining political control. Most developing countries get stuck debating ideology instead of implementing policies that actually work. Second, they experimented carefully before scaling. These special economic zones were experiments. China tested capitalism in a few cities, saw it worked, then expanded nationwide. This reduced risk and allowed them to learn from mistakes in controlled environments. Third, they invested massively in infrastructure. You cannot have economic growth without roads, railways, ports, and electricity. China understood this and built infrastructure ahead of demand, enabling businesses to grow. Fourth, they leveraged their massive population as an advantage. 800 million workers entering the global economy gave China unbeatable scale. No other country can replicate this because no other country has that many people. Fifth, they maintained political stability. Right or wrong, China's authoritarian government could implement long-term economic plans without worrying about elections or public opposition. Democratic countries struggle with this because voters want immediate results, not 40-year plans. But let's also be clear about what China did wrong and the costs. Environmental destruction that will take generations to fix. Inequality that created social tensions. Human rights violations, including mass detention of minorities. Labor exploitation, a surveillance state that monitors and controls citizens, and a political system that offers no freedom of speech, press, or dissent. So can other countries replicate China's success? Probably not fully. China had unique advantages. Timing was critical. China opened up just as globalization was accelerating, and Western companies wanted cheap manufacturing. That window may be closed now. Scale mattered enormously. No other developing country has China's population to offer as workers and consumers. Geography helped. China's coastal location made exporting easy. Landlocked countries can't replicate this. And authoritarianism enabled rapid decisions. Democracies move slower because they have to build consensus. But there are lessons other countries can apply. Invest in infrastructure and education. Focus on economic results over ideology, create special zones to experiment with new policies, integrate into global trade, attract foreign investment and learn from it, build export industries to generate foreign currency. Countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Ethiopia are trying to follow elements of China's model with some success, but none will match China's scale or speed. The bottom line is this: China achieved the greatest poverty reduction in human history. 800 million people escaped extreme poverty in 40 years. That is an undeniable success that deserves recognition, regardless of how you feel about China's government. But it came with enormous costs in human rights, environmental destruction, and authoritarian control. Whether those costs were worth the outcome is a moral question each person must answer for themselves. What's certain is that China's transformation reshaped the global economy and lifted more people out of poverty than any event in modern history. If you want to see another Asian economic transformation story, check out my video on how South Korea went from war-torn to creating Samsung, Hyundai, and K-pop dominance. The link is in the description. If you found this valuable, hit the like button and subscribe, because we're breaking down the economic strategies that shape our world. See you in the next one.